So, there is a common lie told by DIY content creators on this platform. They tell you that with a little elbow grease and a nice finish, that you can build beautiful, high-end furniture out of garbage for free. Today, I decided to believe that lie. I found these 4 miserable-looking pallets in the trash at work. Most normal people would see kindling, but I saw a rite of passage. I mean, are you really a woodworking YouTuber if you don't do a pallet project video? So, I brought them home to see if I could transform actual workplace refuse into a stunning 20 by 20 inch accent table. Yeah, let's not get all misty-eyed and start writing country songs. Let me tell you, the tearing apart phase can only be described as daunting, horrible, and deeply unrewarding. It's a relentless scavenger hunt where the only prizes are tetanus and splinters. When you finally finish, you've extracted a little over a metric ton of rusty nails, and you're rewarded with a pile of wood that still looks exactly like a pile of garbage. Back in the shop, I trimmed off the unusable, rotted ends and spent what felt like 3 business days extracting tiny, broken nail bits from the middle of the boards. I collected hundreds of them. Not for my let's get tetanus collection, but because if I miss even one nail, it's going to ruin my planer when I run the boards through. And I swore on everything I hold dear, mostly I swore on my let's get tetanus collection, that I got every single piece of metal out of these boards. Well, I was wrong. This is blunder number 1. A hidden nail or two instantly nuked my planer glaze. So, if you're keeping track of the budget on this free table, go ahead and add the cost of a brand new set of planer knives to that. After making about 35 gallons of premium, industrial-grade pallet dust, the boards were finally flat. And they still looked like garbage. But hey, consistency is key. Now we've reached the highly technical process of creating one edge on the board that is less wrong than the others. What we are working with here is my budget jointer setup, a table saw, and an unreasonable amount of confidence. I know what you're thinking. I could have easily made a straight line rip jig, but in this case, I only needed to persuade these boards to straighten up just enough to sit nice and smile for the glue up. You'll see what I mean in a bit. That'll work. So, after ripping them to width, I spent a few minutes picking out the sections of these boards least likely to embarrass me later. The standard of good enough was setting the bar way too high for this sorry sack of sawdust. But when all was said and done, I cut them down to a workable length on the miter saw, and then glued about 50 of these miserable strips together butcher block style, which you'll see in a moment. Today on Prairie Homecraft's Small Workshop Woes. You might be wondering why I'm only gluing up a few boards at a time. The answer is that I have to be very size conscious with the projects that I take on. I have the space for a butcher block glue up, but not the space to lay all the pieces flat for a fast glue application. As you can see in the upcoming scenes, this project tests the absolute limits of my small shop's capabilities. But with a little ingenuity and, to my ultimate surprise, I do make it work. Stay tuned. Once the glue dried, it was time for blunder number 2. I realized that I have to fit this massive block of wood that is just a little bit too thick to fit under my router sled. Naturally, instead of engineering a real solution, I just propped up the rails on some makeshift wooden boards. If it looks stupid but works, it's still kind of stupid. But we move on. Now that one side is somewhat flat, it's time to trim the edges to an even more workable size so that I can actually properly fit it underneath my router sled. For this, I broke out my ultra premium poor man's track saw, which is actually just a Craigslist circular saw, a straight piece of oak clamped to the table, and 0 monthly payments. Honestly, I think the oak board cost me more than I paid for that saw, but don't judge me. It got the piece small enough to fit in my crosscut sled, so I could actually crosscut the end grain edges down to a workable size while keeping it somewhat square. And by workable size, I mean I can finally fit it properly underneath the router sled. When I was thinking about this build, I felt a simple butcher block style table would be doable, but also kind of boring. I wanted to elevate this from just a pallet project to a more designer piece, so to speak. And I also wanted to challenge myself to up my woodworking game. I wanted to attempt something I had never done, but I also felt I could potentially be successful with. Something that would push me into that uncomfortable territory that forced me to grow. Hopefully, like many of you watching, I get super inspired by the other woodworkers that I like to watch on YouTube. This idea was inspired by a technique I learned from watching Homemade in Lviv's channel, which I think is actually pronounced like Lviv or something like that. Homemade in Lviv. Well, let's go with Lviv. Homemade in Lviv. So I brought some branch cutoffs from my yard, sliced them into cookies, and arranged them into kind of an organic inlay design that traveled from one side to the other, while also looking like it wrapped over the edge. I've never done inlay work before, so I didn't know if what I was about to attempt would even work, but I went for it anyway. I would love to hear in the comments about a time you stepped outside your comfort zone, tried something new, and how it turned out. Let me know. After I traced the final design, I used a Forstner bit to hog out the bulk of the waste. Then I came back in with a chisel to take care of the rest. I have to say, during this project, I definitely got to spend some good quality time with my wood chisels. Power tools are great and all, but the feel of working with hand tools like chisels, it just hits different. Now, to get the edges just right, I got really well acquainted with my router and carefully followed my pencil marks as best I could while checking that each cookie fit nicely as I went along. And this brings us to blunder number 3. Yeah, that piece needs to be there. I accidentally blew out a sizable chunk of the tabletop there with the router. Fortunately, it isn't my first rodeo with self-inflicted damage, but for now I wanted to concentrate on finishing up this inlaying situation, and I would just figure out how to fix that later. Now, I could have probably continued without this repair, because this piece will be buried inside the inlay, but in its place would be filled with that much more epoxy. So knowing it would be completely hidden under the inlay anyway, I just globbed some glue on it and clamped it in place. If a mistake happens in the wood and you glue it back together before the epoxy pour, did it actually happen? No. I wanted to keep the natural bark on these cookies, which would just save me time. So it's a terrible idea, yes, because the bark loves to separate and fall off, and it's right there against the sapwood. So to prevent that, I drilled multiple tiny holes into the sides of each of these little cookies. The plan was to let the epoxy flow into these holes, creating kind of a mechanical lock that would hold everything in place, the wood, the bark, and the table all together, hopefully until the end of time. After hot gluing everything into its final resting place, I sealed the piece inside a high tech mold of scrap melamine I had laying around with an excessive amount of hot glue. Even though melamine and epoxy apparently don't stick to each other, I still like to coat it all in super cheap packing tape because I've had just great luck with epoxy not sticking to packing tape. It's great. I recommend it. It's time to mix some deep pour epoxy. Pro tip: upgrade a popsicle stick from your kindergarten art supply to industrial mixing technology by chucking it in your drill. Just don't lick it when you're done unless you want a tongue depressor permanently installed in your face hole. My goal here is to pour the epoxy until it overfills the cavities and cures bulging slightly over the level of the tabletop. In this particular project, there was just no way to measure how much epoxy I would need, so I mixed and filled that little cup maybe 4 to 6 times and kept pouring until the right level was achieved. Each of these bigger side pieces definitely drank up the majority of the epoxy. While that black epoxy for the inlay was curing, I also used some coffee colored epoxy to fill in some of the character flaws on the tabletop part of the wood. If only I could use it to cure some of my own character flaws. While that epoxy was curing, it was time for the legs. I committed to using only the pallet wood for this build, which meant I had to manufacture my own dimensional lumber. I didn't have enough deckboard scraps left, so I had to rip down these nasty pallet stringers into somewhat usable strips and then glue them with the leftover deckboard scraps into 8 chunky blocks that somewhat resembled maybe 2x4 cutoffs, but stripy. To ensure all 8 of these blocks were planed to the exact same uniform thickness, I'm using my digital dial calipers from today's sponsor, Welding Stop. Whether you're a professional fabricator or just a guy trying to make trash look expensive in his garage, precision matters. These stainless steel calipers are incredibly accurate, ruggedly built, and don't give you false readings when you're trying to hit an exact measurement. If you want to elevate the accuracy of your shop projects, check out the link in the description below to grab a pair. With all of my stripy looking pallet lumber perfectly dimensioned to size, I cut half lap joints with the goal of creating 2 interlocking X-shaped frames, which will ultimately be connected by 4 legs.
Ah, beautiful.
You may notice this little piece of Purple Heart here from my previous video on how to make a picture frame with splines. It is the exact width of my table saw rip blade. To make perfect half-lap joints, you place your stock piece, which is the width of your lap, between the table saw blade and butt your stop block to it and clamp it in place on your crosscut sled. Then, you put the spacer in between the stop block and your project piece for the first half-lap cut. This aligns the blade perfectly inside your lap for the first cut. Then you just hog out the rest of the waste until you reach the end of your board. The result is a perfect half-lap joint. When I think back on this particular day, I remember just how well everything was going. The half-lap joints all turned out great, and for the first time in this project, I felt like I was really making some headway. I should have realized things were going too well, because right here, I was about to make the biggest blunder of this entire project. I had just glued up the first frame, and now can you see the huge mistake I'm about to make? I'll give you a few seconds to figure it out. And also, feel free to chastise me in the comments section, as I surely deserve it. You see, space and time are finite. These 2 frames cannot physically occupy the same interlocking X shape anymore, because I am gluing them together separately. And they are fully closed loops. If I were a magician, I could pass one solid object through another like the classic magic rings illusion, but I'm not magical. I'm just a guy who did not think this through. So, like any other massive problem in my life, I decided to completely ignore it in the hopes that it just goes away. And decided to focus on adding some design flair by drilling out the corners and driving in some wooden dowels. This adds a ton of structural strength to those half lap joints, and honestly, it looks pretty cool. It also gave me time to contemplate my life choices. In all honesty, the fact that I didn't glue these together the way they were supposed to be in that X formation made this entire process so much easier, especially with the sanding as well. So I guess there is a bright side to this horrible blunder. And while we're on the topic of problems, here I am dealing with another smaller problem with some sawdust and glue, which gets me thinking. Woodworking isn't really about turning wood into furniture. It's about turning problems into smaller problems. It's not so much about making beautiful things out of wood, but in reality, it's just a series of solving one problem after another until you run out of problems. Or wood, usually wood, until eventually, in this case, a table appears. After a while, you realize it's just problem solving. The cutting, sanding, and glue ups are just the medium. The real craft is learning how to look at a problem, figure out a solution, and keep moving forward. And I like that a lot. That's probably why I'm a math teacher in the real world. Back to the tabletop. The epoxy has cured, so it's time to strip the mold. One nice thing about using all that packing tape is that I can now reuse these pieces of melamine again for another pallet project. Yeah, I don't think so. But yeah, the packing tape peels right off these pieces, and then they are reusable. A crucial next step is actually to flatten the bottom. So I do that with a little sanding because there isn't too thick of epoxy there, but it's important so that I can properly flatten the top. After carefully sanding that bottom, it's back to the router sled, again, to run the top through for a final flattening. I will also flip it over and run the sled over the bottom as well. This process produces an ungodly amount of static charged plastic and wood dust that will just haunt my shop for months.
Whew. Dang. That's a lot of sawdust.
Back over to the crosscut sled, I aim to trim the tabletop down to its final 20 by 20 inch dimensions. Here I am mounting some temporary mounting blocks to the tabletop with some tape and CA glue. This is to ensure I can hold the tabletop perfectly in place for my final cuts with some clamps. Here we begin the endless, soul-crushing progression of sanding from 80 grit up to 220, water popping between every stage. I finished it off with a clean 1/4 inch roundover on all of the edges whilst contemplating how I haven't yet solved my table legs mega blunder. Now, to fix the impossible leg situation without using magic. My elegant, highly engineered solution was to take a handsaw and cut a slice right through the bottom center of one of the frames. My thinking is that because it's on the very bottom of the center half lap, that it will hopefully be completely hidden from sight under the table. This cut allowed me to slip the frames right past each other and finally achieve the X shape.
Huh. Would you look at that?
This is very soon going to start looking like an actual table. Here I am finding the exact center of the table and drilling some holes for alignment that I can attach the base with. I plan on pinning the base to the top using some heavy-duty dowels. The method I chose to figure out where to place the holes for the corners, so to speak, is by marking where I'm going to drill the holes on the actual leg frame and putting some tape and then flipping it upside down and kind of placing it centered. I put that peg in there you can't see, and lining it up with my lines, marking both sides, and drawing a line right across to those markings. And that should be exactly where the dowels should line up. In theory. Let's see what happens.
Aha! Ta-da!
To repair the structural wound I inflicted to the base, I tapped into some custom wood inserts I cut off from leftover pieces. Drenched it in glue and sawdust, chiseled it flush, and then softened the edges with some sandpaper. You'd never know it was broken, unless, of course, you watched this video. On the underside of that cross section, I just wasn't happy that you could still see this slight gap in the joint, even after fixing the gaping wound I had sawn into the frame. So I chiseled a wedge from a cutoff piece and smashed it in there with some glue, and then filled the remaining small gaps with glue and sawdust. After a good chiseling and sanding, I really couldn't have been happier with how this whole fix turned out. We are just about ready for finishing. So prior to that, I am sanding the legs with a 320 grit sponge. The sponge will keep the sharp angle look of the legs, but they will have a nice smooth feel to the touch. To finalize the tabletop, I hit it with 320 grit on the random orbital sander as well. For the finish, I'm using the Tillswall Shark 800 HVLP sprayer, which the company sent out to me to use specifically on this project. I've actually never used an HVLP sprayer before, so I was fully prepared to ruin this project at the 11th hour. I'm using an off-the-shelf satin lacquer finish. The instructions state that lacquer needs a 25 to 40 second run-out time through a viscosity cup. I bought a quart of standard deft satin lacquer, and right out of the can, it was already slightly thinner than the 25-second minimum. Perfect. No thinning required. So now all I had to do was pour it in the cup, attach it, plug it in, and start spraying. Prior to actually spraying the project, I wanted to do some test sprays on some scrap to get the feel of the Shark 800 and see what the blast radius was looking like. It's smooth as butter. So far, thumbs up to this Shark 800. I built a makeshift plastic Dexter room in my garage. I promise no one was killed in the making of this video. And threw the table on some sawhorses and just started spraying. Honestly, it couldn't have gone better. The Shark 800 was incredibly easy to set up and lay down a flawless finish. Because lacquer dries so fast, I was able to do 3 coats within a couple of hours. So I'd say for the price point, this sprayer genuinely blew me away. Considering this was my first experience with HVLP Finishing, it couldn't have gone better. The Tillswall Shark 800 was incredibly easy to use and produced a fantastic finish above and beyond anything I could do with a brush or a can of spray lacquer. If you want to up your finishing game at an amazing price, grab the Tillswall Shark 800 from the link in the description below. And there it is, a stunning, high-end, custom-made 20 by 20 inch accent table made from literal garbage and yard waste. I know what you're thinking. Wow, I should go find some free pallets and do this myself. Please listen to me. Do not do this. If you see pallets in the trash, leave them there. That is where they belong. The sheer amount of time, labor, and ruined tools it took to get this wood into a workable condition is a terrible trade-off. I would gladly spend a weekend cleaning out porta potties for the extra cash to buy decent lumber before I ever touch a pallet again. In fact, my shop still has this strange, lingering, nasty smell from that pallet wood, which, ironically, is probably a similar smell I'd be dealing with after cleaning out a slew of porta potties. So, I digress. Let me know what you think of the inlay in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe for more terrible life choices. But leave those pallets for the psychos. See you next time. Yeah, there's totally nothing in that coffee mug. I guess I wanted to prove to you that this trash table could at least withstand the weight of a coffee mug with nothing in it, and not turn right back into the pile of rubble from which it came.